mixed carbs in practice, and we'll come into what this means as we go through. So this is the the actual paper. So glucose, fructose labeling. So it's isotope labeled water, so it gives you very clear understanding of the consumption and how that was utilized in the body in terms of carbohydrates. So they used very high amounts of carbohydrates, i.e. 120 grams per hour, and they did this in either fluid, gel, or jelly chew or blocks, or they did it with the athletes co-ingesting. And I think what was really cool about this study was that it's actually the first time where they've done co-ingestion along the lines of what an athlete would typically do in the field. Some big names on this, obviously Mark Harris, James Morton, Javier Gonzalez, Louise Burke, Trent Stellingworth, they're all very big names. So it was a pretty powerful paper, what they did. So we'll do a quick recap on carb utilization, then we'll do the review of the study, and we'll talk about some key considerations in practical. So if we remember this slide from previous, in terms of the GI tract, what we're looking at here is obviously you eat anything that you're consuming, you're masticating, you're chewing, and that breaks it down into smaller particles, and that goes down through the esophagus into the stomach. Now in the stomach, it is processed, and you will then have gastric emptying from the stomach into the small intestine. And it's within the small intestine where a lot of the magic happens, and that's where these GLUT transporters, so things like SGLT1 and GLUT4 and GLUT5 are going to be present, and they're going to be transporting the carbohydrate across the intestinal membrane into the blood system that then eventually gets it into the muscle. Now, based on the way the body works, is that there are some upper limits to what we call glucose oxidation rate. So effectively, the oxidation rate is the ability of the body to utilize those sources of fuel. So for glucose on its own, the peak glucose oxidation rate is around 1.1 grams per minute. So therefore, around 60, maybe 65, a little bit more grams per hour, if you're looking at that. Okay, so that's 60 to 70 grams per hour for glucose only in terms of using it, and that's going to max out these transporters within the small intestine. So previously, in terms of what we knew or what was being recommended by dietitians and nutritionists in sports, and certainly for endurance events, was that athletes should consume around 60 to 70 grams per hour to perform at their best. Then what starts to happen is that these other transporters started to be discovered. So this was, say, the GLUT5 transporter, and this acts on fructose. Fructose is a different form of carbohydrate. So what they then discovered is that ultimately fructose uses a different transporter, and therefore if you use multiple transportable carbs, i.e. glucose and fructose, you can increase the total amount of carbohydrates that can be utilized by the body. And we saw numbers creeping up to 120 grams an hour. Now, a lot of that was based on single types of fueling. So i.e. using either a liquid, gels, or blocks, and not necessarily all in combination. So again, just recapping on these multiple transportable carbs. So there's different pathways for them to cover. So you can see here with the black line, around 60 grams per hour is sort of the maximum. If you continue to consume more of these single source of glucose, if say you started to go to 80, 90 grams, 120 grams an hour on that single source, you are probably going to induce gastrointestinal problems. And we've seen this before. However, with the multiple transportable carbs, i.e. glucose and fructose, you see that green line, and you can start to increase the amount of grams per hour and likely have less gastrointestinal distress, okay? But as it says here very clearly, gut training is recommended. That's what we push a lot in Fuelin, practicing your higher carb fueling in the training sessions that are specific to that, to allow you to practice your race fueling, to allow you to have a very good race. Okay, so the key considerations here are glucose versus fructose. If you are only going to use around 60 grams per hour, then certainly glucose can be used on its own. If you are going to push above 60 grams an hour, then a combination of glucose and fructose should be considered. Previously, what was studied was a ratio of around 2 to 1, 2 glucose to every 1 gram of fructose. That was investigated, or a different form of ratio was investigated in the study we're going to discuss. We've discussed why it's required. In terms of what this does, in terms of higher carb fueling and what it can do to the athlete, it can change perception. So from the brain, you can improve the way in which the brain perceives fullness in the gut, and that can have a positive impact on the way in which you can perform during higher intensity sessions. We also know that higher habitual carbohydrate intake will improve carbohydrate absorption by increasing these numbers of transporters within the small intestine. Okay. And then that also comes down to these physiological changes. So this SGLT1, GLUT4 will be increased through higher amounts of daily carbohydrate intake, and then by practicing it in terms of repeated high carbohydrate feeding strategies. So if we look at this, we look at these stable isotope traces that were used so that you could get a very clear, and these were injected, as my understanding is, injected into the fluid, the gels, the jelly chews, so that you could get a very clear understanding of what the oxidation rates were. And also in terms of the percentage of how much of the actual products were used as well. So what you can see here is that there was actually fairly comparable high rates of exogenous, there was comparable rates of the amount of carbohydrates that were ingested. So they all took in 120 grams of either carbohydrate liquid, gels, chews, or a mixture of both. When we look at the oxidation rate, so the ability for the body to use these, it was all very, very similar, regardless if it was isolated form or in mixed form. Okay, so the key considerations here is that there was only 8 trained male cyclists. Okay, so without getting too excited about this, I think it is very exciting to see something in real life. What we would be recommending, but it is 8 trained male cyclists. They did carbohydrate load, and they loaded to the rate at which Fuelin would be recommending for a male or a female, at least 8 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrate in the 24 hours preceding. On the morning of the session, they did a exercise meal of 2 grams per kilo body weight. This is a lot of carbohydrates, but it probably relates also to these were highly trained male cyclists who weren't very heavy. So all in all, they were taking somewhere between 120 and 150 grams of carbs in the morning. That is very similar to what Fuelin would be recommending in terms of that race day breakfast and practicing that race day breakfast throughout your training cycle. What they did was 180 minutes of 95% lactate threshold, which is fairly tough. And then they followed that with an exercise capacity test of 150% of their lactate threshold. So it was fairly full on, and maybe not something that everyone would go and do, but certainly what we see with the intensity and the duration of this, they did take in this 120 grams an hour of drinks, chews, gels, or a mixed combination. So what they found from this was that actually oxidation rates could go up fairly high. So this equated to between let's say 1.55 and 1.6 grams per hour, which actually equates to around 90 grams an hour, which is really interesting. So 90 grams an hour was being used. They were being fed 120 grams an hour. The oxidation efficiency was around between 70 and 80%. So what that's saying is, despite taking in everything, it's not all being used, or it certainly wasn't all being used in this case and in this study. What has been seen, though, is peak oxidation rates of up to 2.4 grams per minute, and that actually equates to 144 grams of carbs per hour. So I think what we can take from this is that depending on individuals, there is going to be individual variation, but oxidation rates of at least 120 grams an hour is possible. Certainly 90 grams an hour is going to happen if you are feeding 120 grams an hour. But for certain individuals, and probably related to their athletic ability, because we know that elite trained athletes are better at utilizing carbohydrates, that they probably have these higher peak rates of around that 144 grams per hour. But somewhere between 90 and 144 grams per hour is possible. And that's possible either through drink, gel, chew, or a mixed source, which is really cool to see. I think for me, the really big takeaways from this is it's the first study with stable isotopes investigating real world feeding. So it's not just, liquid carbs, which is what's typically been studied. If you look through any of the work by Asker Udenkrop and his group, a lot of those have been carbohydrate liquids. Obviously, Gatorade studies are all liquids. There have been some other studies looking at the oxidation rates of gels and chews and drinks, but not necessarily a combination of all of them. So I think that's really good to see. And I think more will come out of this. What we know is that all of them, either isolated or in combination, can be used by the body at similar rates. Despite the huge increase or high amounts of carbohydrates that were being consumed, there was minimal GI complaints from any of these athletes. Now, that could be because they're highly trained male athletes and maybe they do this regularly. They were also only cyclists. Okay, so I think a really important takeaway here, if you are a cyclist, it's great news, maybe minimal GI complaints. However, if you are a triathlete or you are a runner, keep in mind it was cyclists only. So it didn't assess it with running. And secondly, it didn't assess it with the run off the bike. What we will typically see with triathletes who struggle with GI complaints is that they're typically consuming large volumes of carbohydrate liquids on the bike. And when that high volume of concentrated carbohydrate liquid is removed and replaced with things like gels and chews, then more often than not, GI complaints do reduce. It's not saying you can't use a carbohydrate liquid. What it is saying is that maybe it needs to be reduced if you do suffer from GI complaints and then gradually reintroduced. It could be a case that either you just can't tolerate it, maybe the transporters within your gut aren't at the sufficient numbers to be able to utilize. Your gastric emptying may need to be trained. So there are those types of things. Bars were not assessed. So what I'm talking about here is energy bars, which I thought was a real shame. It would have been really good for them to study some bars in this. Previous researchers showed that the oxidation rates of bars is lower than gels, liquids, and chews. So that is why generally we will not recommend at Fuelin recommend bars for sprint and Olympic distance. For 70.3, if you can consume a high enough rate of carbohydrates through either liquids, gels, or blocks, we would not be recommending bars. Certainly for Ironman, for total calories, a bar can be utilized potentially on the hour, every hour, to give you an extra lot of calories. Certainly bars can be used in lower intensity sessions where perhaps the need for very fast sort of energy isn't required, and also that you're not working at a pace that could induce GI complaints. I think the other point here, and which we highlighted right at the start, is that it was men only. So there are potential gender issues. I hope in time that this will be replicated with a lot more participants, and also certainly with females, because I think that would be very good. A point that's been brought up in the study as well is that it was sponsored by SIS. I actually don't see that as a major problem. It used SIS products. SIS products were, utilized because they're funding the study, and unfortunately, studies need to be funded in order for them to happen. All the researchers in here are very, very reputable researchers, and I don't believe they would be fudging any numbers to make the study look better than they are. Obviously, James Morton, I think, and Mark Harris are associated with SIS at John Moore Liverpool University, but Louise Burke and Trent Stellingworth are not, as far as I'm aware. So I don't see that as a massive conflict of interest anyway. I think the other thing from this is, based on the slide about multiple transportable carbs, is that training your gut via practicing your race nutrition is paramount to you succeeding in terms of being able to tolerate higher amounts of carbohydrates for your racing. And I think this is a massive part of what Fuelin is pushing, and it's certainly helping athletes be able to consume higher amounts of carbohydrates to allow them to perform better in their racing. But more often than not, it's actually providing them with significant amounts of energy, which is helping them train better and achieve whatever purpose that they're aiming to achieve. And I think just getting rid of that badge of honor of doing sort of the eating's cheating, and I don't need to eat in any of these sessions, especially sessions that are higher intensity and certainly of long duration. It is sort of one of those myths, and I think certainly we are working towards getting athletes to recognize that eating during those sessions is only going to benefit them, and certainly the research is supporting that. So it's pretty short and sweet today. Does anyone have any questions? I look, it's a single study. There are other studies related to oxidation rates, and I think this is supporting a lot of that. Some of the previous research has looked at maybe some slight different oxidation rates between gels, liquids, and chews, but you know, on the whole, they all seem to be working in the same sort of way.
I'll start with one.
Yeah.
Do you know, in the study they had 150 grams of carbs? That was their pre-breakfast. Did they say how much time was in between when they had that feeding and when they started?
I think it was either 90 or 120 minutes. I'm pretty sure. So it was pretty much what we recommend to athletes. If you've got one of those green breakfasts where you're, you know, trying to consume somewhere around that 100 to 150 grams of carbs beforehand, then certainly try and consume it anywhere from 90 minutes up to 3 hours before the session. Now, speaking from practice, I often have at the moment, because my training sessions are in the morning, and I often have green meals just because my total calorie intake at the moment is very high. And you will see, I think it's being released today, timings of meals is going to come into the app. So when we're recommending that athletes eat their actual meals before and after sessions, you will see a recommendation there for things like eat 90 to 3 hours before the session. But there is the caveat to that you can eat somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes before the session to help train the gut. It's a different form of training the gut, i.e. that perception that I talked about, and training the brain to cope with feeling very full. It's probably more often than not what I do. Now, obviously, if you are consuming large amounts very close to the session, keep in mind that you've still got to digest that. So this relates to some of the questions that we had about the fasted training. If you're consuming food very, very close to sessions, technically you're still starting that session fasted if it is in the morning after eating your last meal at dinner. So there is the process of digestion. Just because you eat something doesn't mean suddenly the body can utilize it all. So it will take time. So if you do eat a lot of fuel before that session, immediately before the session, keep in mind the first part of that session is technically going to be fairly fasted.
Do you change your fueling strategy when you eat that closely to the start? Like, will you postpone then eating, or?
No, I haven't been actually. I just keep forcing it in and trying to really train myself. And to be honest, and again, it's only n equals 1, but I'm finding it's just getting easier and easier the more I do it. So I typically have, and I know Jordan, I think Jordan was the one who told me this, but I have a timer on my watch, and I think a lot of athletes are doing that, but I have a timer that goes off every 15 minutes and it says eat. And then at 16 minutes, it says drink. It just keeps it very structured, and I like structure. So it helps, it's just one less thing to think about. It's all just there and it just goes off. And, there's times where I don't want to eat, and sometimes I don't eat because I just feel a little bit too full. And then I just give it a break. And then I think the other thing about like all the consumption is, remember that you typically will have somewhere between 15 and, depending on your total amount, somewhere probably between 15 and half an hour to consume that gel or those blocks. So if you want to have half the gel and then 7 minutes later or 10 minutes later have the other half, do that. You don't need to swallow. Like I looked at I just received some Never-Second gels and the SIS gels, just a trial. And they're actual 40 grams of carbs in each of those gels. Now they're big gels. I think they're about 60 mils of fluid and other content. So it's going to be probably multiple mouthfuls now to get those in. So do I have to consume them all in one go? No, I might have half the SIS gel and then maybe a few minutes later have the second half as I feel comfortable with it. So same with the 3 Cliff blocks. You don't have to eat all 3 in one go. Chew on one and then maybe chew on another and then chew on something else. You got a long time to get through all this stuff. So it's not necessarily a race. As Sarah P often said, it's just an eating contest. That's all it is. And, sometimes slow and the steady and the turtle wins. So just get through it. Were there any questions, around the actual study that was, look, the takeaways are pretty simple. It all works. The reality, what's really nice is the research is supporting that if you're eating everything combined, it all goes into the one place and it's all getting utilized. And I think that's probably the biggest thing, is that don't be shy of mixing products based on your palatability and your taste preference and so on. Very quiet group today.
I know.
Okay.
So,
Amy, you did a gravel race on the weekend. How did you manage your carbohydrates intake? Did you have a Camelback?
So I haven't done one this weekend because it's winter here, but I've done lots of them. I did Unbound, and I usually do. So I did Mid-South gravel was last weekend. I did that last year, and that one's in Oklahoma. Yeah, so I did it last year, and then I did Unbound, which you're on the bike, 8 hours, and then for 100 miles, which, is holding like a 16-mile-an-hour pace in the winds, and you're out there for a long time, so you're burning lots of calories. But I have a Wahoo head unit, and I put a timer on there to eat. But what I find sometimes is like you want to tuck in out of the wind, and I'm in my aero. I don't always want to come out and eat all the time, so I'll eat a lot on climbs. There's a lot of hills and gravel racing, so like I'll kind of get up and out of the saddle and like eat some on the climbs and then hit some on the downhill. So sometimes I just break it up with like how the terrain is. And then in my flat sections, I like to just get down and race and aero. But I try to stick to my timing if I can. I just started with Fuelin in November because
do you tend to? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, I just started in November.
Sorry.
I've done triathlons. I've done Ironmans, lots of them. I just got burned out on them. And so then I started gravel racing. And so now, like I did 6,800 miles last year on the bike, which was a lot more. And I still managed to run and do some races, like shorter races. But I can see where Fuelin's really cool. I started in November, but I made the suggestion to Elizabeth that I think that you guys should branch out into the gravel racing world, because you have to bring your own provisions to these races. And so like that's half the fun of it. I have these fun, like what's in my bag kind of things. And I bring a Camelback, but it's just not for water. Like there's food in there. And they let you have a drop bag. So
I think so the question I've got for you, was probably more around how do you manage? Do you drink your calories? So when I worked with Rach McBride and Neith, we tended to have them drinking their calories so they didn't have to take their hands off the handlebars because of the danger.
Yeah.
So I guess the point being is if, you know, for things like gravel racing and mountain biking, I think what's really good about this study is because you're a cyclist in this case and not running off the bike, then majority of your calories can be consumed through liquids to increase safety. And so I guess the question to you was, are you predominantly using liquid calories when you're doing gravel racing?
So I'll have, because you have to go so far before you'll hit an aid station, like Unbound was 60 miles of riding without an aid. So, and it can be really hot. I have my water in my Camelback, and then I'll have, I'd use the Scratch Super Fuel in one bottle. And then another bottle, I'll have just like noon hydration. And I use like the really big tall bottles. But no, gels, I use real food. I mean, I eat sandwiches. That's the thing about gravel cycling is, you know, cycling, you can eat real food. I mean, I got food tucked places. Like I'll stick a sandwich on the front of my bibs, like a peanut butter and jelly. Yeah. So like there's lots of opportunity to eat lots of calories if you can. It's not just liquids.
Yeah. Okay. So, and it's always interesting, and it's nice again from, you know, different individual athletes is, you know, when talking to Rach and to people like Ange, they didn't necessarily feel comfortable. They wanted to go as fast as they could. They don't want to take their hands off it. And so I think,
Yeah,
and it's the same with triathletes is that
yeah.
if we look at some of the pro athletes who are going very, very fast, often they will drink their calories just to improve not coming out of aero position and trying to manage that. So, but I think,
I mean, Rach, she is a elite. She made podium, you know, so like those people are riding in a pack though. And so I can see where gels would be more applicable to them. They're not the everyday, like I'm a 46-year-old age grouper. Like I'm going to maybe like get into a Peloton and in a good pack with my buddies or friends. But we're going to back off a little bit and, you know, chill too and stop for a train or, you know, eat a bar here or there. But those types of racers like her, or they rather, she's awesome. Like she's right up there in the front. She won. And it's so neat to see that. But I could see where she would want fast things to grab and eat.
Don't worry, I struggled with it initially.
I know. I mean, I follow her for the longest time. I listen to all her podcasts, and she dips. She's like me because they like me. They're like me because she said she dips both sides, right? She goes to Ironman and she goes to gravel events. So I just love it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, cool. Lynn, you jumped on a little bit late. Sorry. We've actually gone through the study. We will record it, and you can review it. Effectively, what the key takeaways from the study is that mixed carbohydrate sources, gels, blocks, or liquids can be utilized by the body at very high rates with minimal GI complaints if it's something that's practiced regularly, which is nice to know and sort of really supports what we're doing here at Fuelin in terms of the recommendations. I think the biggest thing for all the athletes on here is that you are doing the carb capacity testing. And looking at what your numbers look like, and are you seeing a graded increase in that amount of carbohydrates that you can tolerate on an hourly basis, and make sure that that is creeping up to a number that you feel very comfortable with without developing any sort of GI complaints. Matt, how are you doing with everything?
Good. Probably not what I should be doing, but I had a big chocolate chip cookie before I got on.
That's all right.
But yeah, I'm. You know, the season's just kind of starting, so just kind of getting more back in. Been kind of lackadaisical all winter, but kind of in and out with it. But yeah, kind of trying to get more focused now.
That's good. Yeah. What's your first race? You're not doing Oceanside, are you?
No, I've got a half Ironman in June at some point. I might do a half marathon next month. I haven't decided, but really I got a sprint in May and then a half in June, and then I kind of don't have anything planned for the summer. So we'll kind of see how that goes. Probably looking for more shorter, faster stuff, and then we'll see. For next year, I'll probably do another Ironman, I think.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. And Jenny, you're doing well. Everything's ticking along. I see your questions.
Doing okay. Learning a lot.
Very good. Very good. That's what you got to do. So, look, I'm quite happy. This is a very short one. I think it's reinforcement as much as anything of research supporting what is being done and what's being done in practice. And I think that's a super important lesson for not just Fuelin athletes, but any endurance athlete out there, that, you know, what you're doing in practice. And when you read about these athletes taking in high amounts of carbohydrates, it is supported by the research, and more research will come. And, you know, whether upper limits of 144 grams an hour is the top of the limits, maybe there are other ways of doing it through other forms of carbohydrates. And I have heard that there are other things being developed. So I'd say it's watch this space and see how we go. But in the meantime, keep getting them in.
I do have one question on the sweat test. How do you actually understand how much sodium you should be aiming to get in?
Yeah, I think if you haven't had a actual sweat sodium test, then unless you're covered in white salt at the end of the day or after every session, then probably aim somewhere between 200 and 500 milligrams per liter to consume, and then adjust based on how you're feeling, whether you're getting any GI complaints, whether you're getting any sensations of cramping, energy, things like that.
Okay.
So look, more often than not, yeah, you won't have to take in high amounts of sodium unless you know that you're a very salty sweater. And somewhere again in that range is probably very safe. Somewhere, yeah, let's say 300 to 600 milligrams is probably a good range to somewhere sit in. And certainly you don't need to be taking in electrolytes for every session. Certainly sessions lasting less than 60 minutes, water is completely fine to consume.
Okay.
So, very good. And Amy, we will catch up with you. I did see your messages with Elizabeth. I saw she was handling it. So we'll set up a meeting about that, because it certainly is on the roadmap. It's certainly on the roadmap. It's just been a very focused approach to triathlon at this point in time, and then we'll start to broaden it out. But as mentioned, like, have worked with those gravel races and had really good results. And same with Ultraman. Richard Thompson won the World Ultraman, and it's not something that we highlight a lot, but you know, we did work with him, and he won World Ultras, and he's going for what's called the sub 20 challenge, which is a double Ironman in under 20 hours. And that's coming up very shortly. So there are things working in the background. It's always just about the initial focus and getting everyone dialed in that sense. But yeah, certainly happy to have that conversation and talk more, because gravel racing seems to be exploding in the US, which is very cool to see. And I'm sure the rest of the world will follow. And obviously ultra endurance and marathon runners and all that is it's a huge market and a huge population of people that we believe we can help. Cool. Okay. We'll send you an invite for that. That'd be fantastic.
Okay. Sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Short and sweet, but hopefully you got a lot out of it. And please fill in the questionnaire at the end, and just let us know if you got up anything you want discussed or how the session went, and we'll go from there. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, Heidi.